Well, with that, looks like we're at the top of the hour. So we'll jump on. We'll start out right on time. Welcome, everyone. My name is Charlie Dubbe. I'm the head of regenerative partnerships at Agrology. Really great to see everyone. This is part of a webinar series that Agrology hosts, really trying to be, just a space for kind of continuing education and for us to bring in leading experts in a variety of different topics and really, dig in and really kind of understand whether it's regenerative agriculture or how to measure carbon in soils or gas flux or regenerative certifications. In this one, we're talking about AgTech, and we're really excited to have Walt Duflock of Western Growers. He's the Senior VP of Innovation, and it's been a real pleasure to get to know him over the past year or so. Walt, thanks so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you. I'll just do, before we ask you to intro yourself, I'll just do a quick set of housekeeping. So if everyone can just keep themselves on mute, that way we don't hear any crazy background noise that you don't want us to hear. Please add any questions or comments into the chat. We will do a Q&A with all the questions that come in the chat at the end of this, after I ask Walt some questions. And then we will send out a recording as well. So that'll go out in a follow-up email tomorrow. And with that, Walt, if you want to just start us out, I would love to just hear a little bit of your background. How long have you been at Western Growers, and how do you know so darn much about the AgTech ecosystem?
It's a great question, one of my favorites. So it's a great background for this topic, Charlie, and I've enjoyed getting to know you and the Agrology guys as well. I think it's some really cool stuff you guys are up to, and obviously some of our growers like it, which is a good thing. So my background is two parts. I come from a fifth generation family farm in South Monterey County. We do cattle, wine grapes, leafy greens down there. And when my folks split, I ended up with summers in Imperial, school year in Monterey County, and that's a rough trade-off. I would have traded that in a second because the desert's super hot in the summer, but I was down at my dad's ranch doing hay and cattle for a few years and summers down there. And so got a chance to see SoCal Ag, NorCal Ag, and then quickly ran away from both and went to Silicon Valley. Spent about 25 years at tech startups, not AgTech. AgTech wasn't a thing back in the 90s, right? For goodness sake. So I was at eBay, a couple others that got acquired. And then right around 2015, I was doing soulless, mind-crushing enterprise sales and marketing. No, I'm kidding. I enjoyed the startup that I was at, but we're in Vegas. Three of us are sitting at an airport bar, and okay, we're moving. We're all going to get out of enterprise data center stuff. And my move was to AgTech, and it was for two reasons. Number one, my Silicon Valley guys kept asking, what's going on down there in Salinas? And my Salinas guys were like, what's going on up there in that valley of yours? And to watch those two worlds come together in the last almost 10 years has been really fun. And there's a lot that ag can learn from Silicon Valley, but there's probably even more that Silicon Valley could learn from Salinas Valley. And so I get to be right in the middle of it. And I went to Thrive first, helped build that accelerator up. That was a lot of fun. That's a company that works with 10 to 15 accelerator companies a year. Helps get them bigger, helps get them going. And then I came to Western Growers about 3.5, almost 4 years ago. And the two main missions at Western Growers are help solve the labor problem, both shortage and availability. And that's automation. And that's things like carbon robotics, the laser weeder, Stout, FarmWise, things like Burrow, FarmNG, and then help solve the chemistry problem. We're getting increased pressure. We'll talk about this more, I'm sure, over the course of this, but there's regulatory pressure and buyer pressure on all kinds of chemistry. And so we need biological solutions and smart climate solutions like your guys to really help. We like to call it a portfolio, not a transition, Charlie. Mm-hmm. So in our mind, there's chemistry and biology solutions, there's climate smart solutions. All of those work together to optimize for the grower's operation. And that's where we sit in the middle. So we sit between our 2,500 specialty crop growers, fruits, nuts, and vegetables, and the 1,200 automation startups, the 700 biologicals, or sorry, other way around, 700 automation startups and counting, 1,200 biologicals and counting. And in the words of Bruce Taylor, our former chairman who got this thing all kicked off almost 10 years ago in AgTech for Salinas, can we just make it happen faster? So that's my goal, is just to make those two topics happen faster. And you guys are pretty much in the sweet spot of that second one.
Yeah, amazing. I'm curious to dig in a little bit more. What you mentioned you think Silicon Valley can learn a lot from Salinas Valley. I would love to hear you just riff on that for a second.
You know, I, I'll say it this way. I've known Silicon Valley CEOs, I've worked for a couple of Silicon Valley CEOs who have built nothing compared to the companies that are down in our space in one generation. You've got Bruce Taylor. Now, granted, Bruce's family had Church Brothers and Fresh
Mhm.
Express, but Bruce built Taylor Farms in 30 years, and it's a multi-billion-dollar company. You've got first generation guys like Mike Way and the primetime guys. I'm dropping the names on some others, but you've got generational operators. You've got first generation operators who have just killed it, right? I'll give you another couple examples. Steve Barnard, Mission Produce, first generation. He was, again, Steve was signing the back of the check in his
Yeah.
20s, right? Now he's signing the front of a lot of checks,
Yeah.
right? And so you've got all these Salinas Valley guys, all these Central Valley guys who know how to do ag at scale, and they are such great guys, such great gals, down to earth folks. We just had the Western Growers Board meeting up in Sacramento. And I think Silicon Valley could learn a lot about humility and long
Yeah.
time frames from ag because
Yeah.
we think in generational terms and we think in terms of 10, 20, 30 years. And a lot of startup guys doing mobile apps and fintech stuff, they think in terms of 3-year windows. They do not build stuff that lasts. They do not build it to last. And
Yeah.
that's a lesson I talked to a lot about up in Silicon Valley when I have lunch with my guys is, look, you guys think in terms of short windows. You guys think in terms of quick exits. That's not how our guys think about tech. And
Mm.
even if they're not coming down here, they could learn a lot from our guys.
That's such great insight. I really love that. And then, on top of that, right? In general, there's just such thin margins. Like, how do you build such a successful, massive company like Taylor Farms or like all the other ones you mentioned, when so often, the margins just razor thin. And
Yeah.
very different than the Silicon Valley or kind of the traditional tech space.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of sort of finances and funding, you did a post recently about agri-food tech funding and how it's decreased from 50 billion in 2021 down to 30 billion in 2022 and then now down to 15 billion in 2023. That's
Yeah.
down
Incoming.
9%. I just want to know, from your perspective, A, what the heck happened here? And then B, where is this going?
Yeah, no, it's a great question and it's the question. So I go to a lot of shows and I've been at Tulare, World Ag. I've been at World AgriTech up in San Francisco. I've been to Southwest Ag Summit, Organic Grower Summit last couple of months. And this was the slow moving train wreck you could see coming, Charlie,
Mm.
right? And so when you look back at that 50 billion, and I've been very public, I've been very loud about this. I won't quiet down now. Happy to say I'm right. I said at the time, controlled environment ag and alternative proteins were the two biggest threat factors to the space because what the media, and I'll call out all of the media, including AgTech media on this one, including our partners at Ag Thunder News, who I love, everyone got way over their skis and got really excited thinking that vertical farming was going to take over the world and kick all our guys to the curb and in the head. And I just looked at that and I said, if you look at the economics for 2 minutes, right, and you look at what it costs to build a vertical farm and what it costs to power a vertical farm and what that was going to take to do at scale globally, you're like, whoa. And these venture capitalists are doing due diligence, or were they, and writing big checks. And same in the all protein space. They're competing with JBS and Cargill and all the big guys, and people just forgot that neither of these were greenfield opportunities. So while we hype them, and while they blew up to 42% of the venture capital funding, there was never a solid value prop, Charlie, for either one of those two spaces, right? So 50 billion in 2021, but that was a house of cards because 42% over 20 billion of that was those two spaces. And so when they started to underdeliver, the venture capitalists got wise a little bit late and stopped writing checks. That led to part one of the slowdown. Now, it got a little bit worse than that, right? So we have those two spaces that are just literally dumpster fires in a huge segment. That took it down to 30, just cooling them off. The reason we went down to 15.6 is even more troubling. And this you hear at a couple different places. And I listen to a lot of content. I got a lot of windshield time. So I'll give you guys to the listeners, two podcasts to listen to on this topic. All In podcast, that's the Jason Chamath, David Sachs and Freeberg, the old Climate Corp guy. They do a great job on these topics. And BG2, Brad Gerstner, Bill Gurley, they do a great job. And what they're saying is, and this is true of all tech, not just ag tech, the limited partners that fund the venture firms are sitting on a boatload of money, right? I mean, just an awful lot of dry powder. They are not funding venture capital like they used to. They are telling their GPs, their general partners at venture capital firms, I got 18 of you, I'm cutting half of you, or I got 20 of you, and I'm cutting y'all by half. So they're either cutting the funding in or they're cutting the number of funds they support. That is a massive problem. What it's telling you is limited partners are less confident in venture capital as an asset class at the moment, right? And so you see a bunch of guys with dry powder on the sidelines. They're not going to bring it back in until we see the IPO window reopen, right?
Yeah.
And so, well, bigger than that, they need to see exits, right? So if you think back to the IPO window in the 2008, 2009 timeframe, old eBay, not colleague, we worked in the same building, but Jeff Jordan, he worked, layers up the org for me. But Jeff went to OpenTable, and Jeff led the parade back out after the financial crisis with the OpenTable IPO. And that was, I mean, listen to some podcasts on it from A16Z, they're fantastic. That was a lift, right? And we went from, again, the last couple of years, kind of COVID, we went from 60 to 80 IPOs to like 5 to 10 a year, right? And that is a problem for the space because without exits, you don't have returns. Without returns, you can't chase that next fund. So venture capital is in a little bit of trouble. We thought that Instacart might reopen the IPO window last year. That was a failed hypothesis. Instacart did not. And in fact, Instacart was a bit of a train wreck. People don't know this, everyone after the C round of Instacart lost money, right? And so even the later round investors in Instacart look at the Instacart IPO and say, not good. And so you've got a bunch of headwinds for funding. You've got an IPO window that's shut. That really leaves one thing, right? There's M&A at that point. And so you start to look at the M&A window in 2024, and it's going to largely be the strategics. It's going to be the John Deere's, Case New Holland's, Agcos. Agco did a deal with Trimble last year for 1.8. Case New Holland is doing deals with folks like Stout. Deere is doing deals with folks like Gus. So I mean, you're seeing some activity. Deere bought Blue River 7 years ago. Jorge came in. Deere then bought Egino Bear Flag a couple years ago and did the autonomy announcement, right? And so you are seeing activity in that space, but boy, we could use it to heat up a little bit because it's those guys and it's the large input folks. It's the Bayers and Gentis, UPLs of the world. They're going to be the folks that can reopen the window, I think, because I don't think we're going to see that many AgTech companies get to an IPO position. So that's a long answer, Charlie. Sorry.
No,
I mean,
that was.
There's a ton going on in the space at the macro level for all tech, and we're a victim of that too.
Totally. It sounds like that's a really big piece of it, right? Is it's just the macroeconomics and kind of the cooling off of these IPOs and just the venture capital space in general, right? There's just a lot more skepticism compared to when everyone was hot to trot in 2020 and 2021. So I know you mentioned in some of your posts kind of that you think that we will start to see more alternate sources of funding to really kind of make up that gap in the AgTech space. What are you seeing there, and what kind of alternate sources of funding are you referencing or thinking about?
Yeah, it's funny. And I would say one of the sort, like you would hope that venture capitalists would see some of these good returns in AgTech when they show up, the exits like Bear Flag and others and Gus to Deere and some of the stuff happening. You'd think that would loosen up some wallets. Unfortunately, I do have to call out one more macro capability. We had 50 billion in AI funding last year. Remember, that's all of AgTech in 2021, right? And AI is a little newer. So that I don't think it's a zero-sum game in venture, but I do think that 50 billion probably took away from a lot of other segments that weren't expecting to go negative. So that's even forcing the pressure even more. What I would say is there's going to be two folks that get involved. The private equity guys are going to come deal hunting, right? Look at our two big spaces, right? 700 going on 800 automation, 1,200 biologicals. And, Pam Marone and I were having coffee last week after an ag labor conference in Davis. And I was talking to some other investors at World AgriTech. I mean, and this is the brutal truth, Charlie. 1,200 biological startups, 800 of them will probably find themselves in harm's way in the next 2 years. So between now and spring of 2026, I am going to get a lot of calls and emails from guys I know going, hey, how's it going? And got time for a call. And I do, and I will. and I'll take those calls, and we'll try and get as many of those to a good finish line as we can. But they're good. They're going to be failed startups, and there's going to be a lot of failed startups because we funded a lot of startups, right? And we keep funding a lot of this stuff when it doesn't deliver a solid value proposition for the growers. And so I think you're going to see private equity folks starting to show up and do some, whatever you want to call it, right? Bottom feeding, looking for deals, hunting value. They will look for roll-ups. They will look for stuff they can buy and glue revenue together. I actually do think that if the private equity guys have a reasonable sales team and go-to-market channel for a couple startups, they can glue other stuff onto that. I've seen that game a couple times, right?
Yep.
You can do some roll-ups with some sales action. And then again, back to those guys I just mentioned, the strategics, right? The Deeres, the Bayers, the Yamahas, they can buy. So VCs and PEs, they're getting involved for one reason: financial returns. Their whole world is the spreadsheet, right? The Deeres, the Bayers, the Yamahas, again, I mentioned it earlier. Why does Deere buy Bear Flag? In part because they wanted Gino and his team to make autonomy get even better, right? Why did they buy Blue River? They wanted their stuff to get even better, and they wanted the talent to be building the software side of the business around that, right? So they can invest for strategic outcomes without being solely focused on financial outcomes. That is a good thing. It will lead to some tough conversations because no startup wants to talk about a down round or a down raise or a down M&A activity. But when that's the only offer on the table, again, the term sheet you've got is the term sheet you've got until you've got a second one. And so, we'll see where it all goes. But my alternate sources of capital are the private equity and the capital markets that have a little longer time frame than venture and can treat it a little bit different. That's their main advantage in the space, is they can take a longer view, right? From the strategic side, here's what I think is going to happen with them. I think if you look at Deere, Case New Holland, and I'm not picking on any of them, right? This is just the big company thing globally. It's harder and harder to squeeze the juice out of R&D inside, right? Cost inflation's driving salaries up. Expensive engineers are getting only more expensive and harder to find, harder to keep. So the ability of Deere, Case New Holland, Bayer, Syngenta to build the next great thing internally continues to get harder. I think we're going to see a massive shift in capital from R&D to M&A and strategic investment in those shops, because I just think the R&D is getting too hard to prove and too hard to show the returns. The obvious answer to that is, in many cases, just switch the funnel and put it somewhere else. So I'm hopeful that they'll continue to make that shift. I think it's already happening in real time, but it's going to bear watching. So those are some of the capital sources I watch to see where wallets are likely to come from.
Yeah, that's super insightful. Thanks for that. Well, let's see. My next question is kind of transitioning a bit to regenerative ag. In a recent post, you said that you see a real lack of traction in regenerative ag. Lots of talk, not a lot of walk. And you describe this really as an economic model problem. I was hoping you could kind of dive into this a little bit more. What is holding regenerative ag back from scaling when it has been demonstrated on many sites that there's a lot of operational efficiencies to unlock, although we know there's a bit of a transition. How do we scale it and grow the market share without confusing consumers more? Having a ton of different certifications or labels out there, and kind of what do you see as the thing that's going to unlock just wider adoption of regenerative agriculture?
Yeah, no, and I think the regen movement was doing a nice job at becoming a little, cottage shop industry and doing the no-till and doing some of the cover crops and doing some of the practices we all hear about. Not in specialty crops, but livestock grazing, things like that. So there are ways to make an ecosystem that's more, pick your word, sustainable, regenerative, whatever. And I think you had a lot of true believers in that movement early. And unfortunately, and I don't even blame anybody, I think this is what happens when they started to get to scale, new voices came in and they got really loud. And so to your exact point, I think regenerative went from being seen as a set of farming practices that farmers could test out, trial, spend money and time on, right? It's not free. And see where they wanted to go. And we see that with folks like Braga and all these guys doing these new regenerative tactics. Taylor's doing the same thing. All the big guys are dabbing a toe in the water, if not a foot. And regeneratives managed to, good and bad news, go from being something that was maybe more grower focused to something that's more buyer and consumer focused. And now you do have that confusion in the marketplace. So, right. So if you think about organic organic has done a terrible job of defining itself and a terrible job of enforcing itself while becoming a $60 billion industry, right? So
Yeah.
it's up to 10 points in a lot of markets, and it's seen double-digit growth for a long time. But organic messed itself up by just letting everybody use the word loosey-goosey, by doing a terrible job of then letting people market it to consumers loosey-goosey, by not having guys at the ports checking the word organic out on stuff at the Port of Long Beach and other West Coast ports. And regenerative runs that same risk. So organic is now cranking out. This is the launch month for their new stronger organic enforcement. And you are seeing a lot more certifications as people realize I need to get certified and be legit in organic. Well, regenerative better learn from things like organic and get through that cycle faster, because organic took a long time. And so while there are tailwinds from the goodness regenerative can deliver, I think there's confusion among the consumers. There's confusion among a lot of the folks at the retail level. You're putting a lot of words in front of consumers on packaging, right? You're using regenerative, locally grown, organic, et cetera. So I think we need to get back to the basics, which is how do we get, because really at its heart, regenerative is how can we make the soil health better on the growing operation side? It was never really meant to be a consumer facing thing. What happened was people figured out if we can get premium pricing, like the Braga deal with Whole Foods that got announced last year on the broccolini offtake agreement, right? If you can get premium pricing, great, that'll pay for the practice. And that'll pay for some of the practice, but it won't pay for all of it. So we need to go back to getting farmers the tools they need and the economics they need to test a bunch of different stuff, because every farmer will tell you and every farm will show you that fields a mile apart and fields across the river from each other, very different set of soil, water, characteristics, all of that. And to think that you can just roll regen out, I think, again, the media, right, got over its skis and said, oh, this is great. We can all just go do this tomorrow and we can copy paste like a coloring book, and you can't. It takes a long time. The Braga team will tell you, and then everyone doing regenerative, it takes a long time and a lot of failure to get it right and a lot of testing. And as your crop rotations change, these are living, breathing organisms that change with it. You're going to get some unintended stuff that happens. You're going to have to spend time and money to fix those after you get the rollout done. So regenerative is partly a victim of its own success and partly a victim of more bottoms up than tops down. So there's no real central governance around it, but it's going to need some central governance soon, because what I saw at OGS was interesting, right? Organic wants to co-opt regenerative and make it little sister. Regenerative doesn't should be a little sister. Regenerative wants to be its own thing and loud and proud. And I think and we've got what, 12 groups defining regenerative. That may be one of the problems, Charlie. You've got like a dozen groups, some in Sacramento, some outside, some in industry, trying to define what's regenerative. I don't think we're going to end up on one definition soon. And I think that's a mistake.
No, I think it's complicated, like you referenced. One practice done even just across the street or across the river is going to have a completely, there's no just like cover cropping is cover cropping is cover cropping, right? It can't be prescriptive. And I think that's really Agrology's sweet spot. And I think that's a space we're really excited to add our value into, but it's really complicated and nuanced, right? Because essentially we're saying, well, there's this set of sort of regenerative practices that you can play with. Cover cropping, no-till or reducing till, reducing herbicides, introducing livestock, all these things. But it's going to have a completely different impact on every single field. And so we actually have to measure that. And then we're starting to see there's more and more kind of consensus in the regenerative camp that it's going to be an outcomes-based system as opposed to organic, where it's just practice-based. But that makes it a lot more complicated, because you're going to have, I think, it's going to be a bigger space of regenerative agriculture, much bigger than organic, where it's like you either stay on the NOP list or you don't. And so we're going to have sort of this whole spectrum of folks who are just starting to dabble into regenerative and they're part of their transition. And then the folks over here who are like regenerative organic certified. And we're going to have to kind of explain all of that to, at the very least, retailers, but probably ultimately to consumers. I'm curious, is that even possible? And how do we avoid sort of having the whole thing watered down and just turned into, the next term like sustainable, where now, most consumers sort of view sustainable as like, that doesn't really mean much. I don't actually think there's any there.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think every day that goes on where folks are using sustainable in marketing materials, whether that's print, online, or in stores, I think we run more of that risk, right? So the confusion at the consumer, it starts at that 3-second walk by in the produce aisle, right? And you've got 3 seconds to make a buy decision, and the packaging has to speak to you quickly. And if they see regenerative and they make a buy decision on it, and they take that product back and it's not what they were expecting, you're organic version 2, right? And you don't want that. So I think the way you solve that is to clearly define it, put a marketing campaign around it, right? And it's, you know, I go back to the wine industry, the Gallos and the Mondavis, right? I mean, they didn't wait for the government to define all this stuff. They sort of did it, pushed things forward. They asked permission, not forgiveness. Look up some of the stories on those guys. They really paved the way. And look at, you know, Mission Produce and Avocados and some of the folks that have been the leaders in our industry, you know, Taylor and Fresh Express and those guys in the bag salad stuff. You've got to put packaging out there that's consumer tested, consumer proven, and works.
Yeah.
And I think if the industry, so the industry needs to coalesce around, and so it's somewhat on us, right? The ag industry coalesce around organic, regenerative, and are they coexisting and or are they the same thing? In some ways, it would be great if there was an organic plus and regenerative was part of that. In some ways, that'd be the worst thing, right? And you see both voices, and there are reasonable voices on both sides of that one, for sure. So I think part of it's just definitional, but the real part of it is the economics, because again, the large operators, they can pay for this with time and money. Your Bragas, Taylor Farms, and all those, they can pay for these kinds of practice changes in real time. The smaller operators, it's a lot harder. So to the extent that California says they like small farmers, and I would argue the numbers prove they don't, because of the regulatory costs and all the increases in the business environment that just make it more challenging for labor and general regulatory. The small farmers can't adopt these. I mean, if you're wrong as a small farmer on one of these regen practices, that could go from you writing, you know, your name on the front of the checks to the back of the checks.
Yeah.
We have seen that with organic, right? My cousin, right? At farming on us, we end up with a lot of pipe instead of a rent check. I mean, it happens. And so here he is, he's an organic farmer. He gets a bad spray one day. He can't get his way out of that, and he's got to go away. The regen guys are the same thing. If you try no-till at the wrong time, if you try the wrong cover crop, if you can't get out of that mess and your margins are thin, you're in a world of hurt. So I think, to me, the economics of regen matter more than the messaging around regen, because the economics are what will drive the practice adoption. And I don't think that you can Braga Whole Foods your way out of this, right? Because there's only so many Braga Whole Foods offtake agreements to be signed. So I think long-term, you've got to fund these practice changes when you want to incent them. And for that, Charlie, you've got to have way more verifiable, way more auditable, way more secure and proven ways of doing this stuff. This is where you guys come in a lot of the time. But you can't tell that farmer, that grower, hey, I'm going to give you dollars for this carbon, right? And then 10 years later, so Guy sells carbon credits to Microsoft for their data centers and AI stuff. And there's going to be a lot of power needs on data centers and AI. I just looked up some numbers. You're like, whoa, that's crazy to think what all these fancy AI tools are going to need. So if they're burning power, they're going to be looking for carbon offsets. They're going to buy them from farmers. If 10 years later, some shareholder activist like a PAGA lawsuit guy now goes out and sues and says, hey, I don't think that carbon's really in the ground like they said it is, and they do an audit and they show the results that don't say the carbon's in there, and the grower's at 100% of the risk and has to give that money back 10 years later, that's not a market that the grower is going to warm to, right? That's not interesting. And at $15 a ton for carbon, it's not that interesting economically. Yeah. So in my mind, we've got to fix the economics of these marketplaces. We've got to fix the economics around carbon. We've got to make this more, you know, this is like eBay, right? When you think about eBay, when I got there in the 90s, late 90s, 98, 99, you had people doing transactions. 99% of the transactions were cashing checks in an envelope. Over time, we added PayPal, right? By the time I left in 06, it was 99% electronic payments, no checks and cash. Amazing flip in 7 years, right? Yeah. So we went from, I'm dropping this check in the mail to a guy in Jersey, what could go wrong, to, okay, I'm PayPaling him. And then I have, for the collectible space, I've got escrow accounts. I've got verified authenticity of signatures and items like the Honus Wagner baseball card. So
Mm-hmm.
eBay had to build stuff around the marketplace to make it more secure, to make it more transaction friendly, to make it more friction free is what we used back then as a buzzword.
Mm-hmm.
We're there with carbon. We're eBay in the 90s. We're dropping cash in checks and envelopes and hoping it all works. And that may work for 1,000 people. It's not going to work for 1,000,000. Right. So we've got to build this thing out at scale with tools that support it and give buyers confidence and sellers confidence that that marketplace will be what it says. And that 10-year later audit will not impact my checkbook.
Yeah. All right. So I'm giving you a magic wand, right? You're King Walt now. You can wave this wand
Putting
and
my crown on.
yeah. How do you de-risk this for growers? How do you make this work, right? Like what whether it's capital pools or even like, I don't know, potentially state government intervention and subsidies. How do we de-risk this for growers and really scale regenerative ag while also building out kind of the supply chains and the economics? Like, how do we make this work?
Yeah, no, and you said government like 2 times in there, and I'm the conservative libertarian small farm boy going, God, that can't be the answer, but damn it, it probably has a role. And so I think if you think about what I just walked through in terms of risk, right? So the guy's got to do practice change on his operation.
Risk.
He's got to count the carbon that's going underground. So cost and some risk, right? He's got to keep that carbon underground. He may have to change his practices back on part of that later, right? Can he do that? And is that at risk? And in the back of his mind, if he's selling thousands of carbon credits at $15 a pop, he's racking up, $15, $20, $50,000 in carbon credits over 10 years. That sounds like $500,000, right? And so I think if there were a way, and I won't say crop insurance, but I'll throw it out there as a carbon insurance, right? Is there a carbon insurance product that you can have? And maybe this is Nori in the carbon marketplace is doing it. And to be honest, I need to go check. It's been a few months since I checked in. They might be doing some of this now. But like I mentioned with eBay, if you had some confidence that when you sold those carbon offsets, you wouldn't eliminate future exposure, but it would say, I'll cap your exposure at X and you can insure for Y. Right. Yeah. So that if that $500,000 got bought for like $2,000 a year as an insurance policy, and it's just an annuity spend that I need to make to guarantee that, that would reduce the financial risk of those practices going sideways in the future audit. Because I guarantee you, when you make this marketplace big enough, there will be bad actors that show up and try and take advantage of the capital that's flowing around. Right. So there will be lawsuits, there will be audits from shareholder activists to challenge the carbon offsets over time. And you just have to know that. So the only way to de-risk that is to change the financial either incentives or system to allow the growers to buy their way out of that risk.
Yeah.
Not the only way, but that's one of the ways.
No, that's a great one. I hope some people are listening right now.
I hope some entrepreneurs reach out because I've got thoughts and I've even got a few lead startup canvases that I've worked on over the years. I'm happy to share. I'm kind of busy, but I'm happy to send a guy on their way with them.
Amazing. Look at that. Free business. So kind of follow-up question to that. You were talking earlier about how regenerative agriculture used to really be kind of grower focused, right? And it was about operational efficiencies, right? Healthy soil does a lot, including sequestering more carbon, but it also helps with water retention, nutrient cycling, better structure, soil structure, better quality of crops, all these things, right? And now we really I see a lot of times regenerative agriculture is really kind of moving into, or there's this large element of identity politics and dogma and kind of anecdotal evidence and almost this dogma around, well, like, no-till is a religion. How do we move, or how do we keep regenerative agriculture kind of open and accessible? And how do we keep it focused on, this is just better farming that prioritizes soil health and that builds soil health? Do you see, case studies and on-farm data helping achieve that, or kind of talk about sort of that dynamic there?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. How do you get the word out and share with folks that there is risk, but there is upside, and you can get capital this way, and there's upside there. And a lot of it is education, and we're doing it now, Charlie, and you're part of it, and we're part of it, and it's Braga Fresh Field Days, right? So Rod Braga and his team, Eric Morgan and Katie Chiapuzio leading the way. They are going to do 2 fresh field days a year where they show off the technology, they show it off in practice, They show off some of the details on it, and they basically open the process up. They open up the mistakes they made. They open up the wins they've got. They talk about products like Agrology out there, and they show it in the field and how it's working. And they talk about, here's what we learned when we rolled out Agrology and these other 3 products. We could change certain things, and then there were a few things we had to change, right? And so what I think that the Braga team's done that is great is they've been willing to share the mistakes that equate to time and money out the door, right?
Yeah.
And tell everyone, don't do this. Don't do this. And so it just helps as a reminder that the ag community is a community that works together hard, even when they compete 24/7, 365 for buyers, right? They are still working awfully hard on getting the word out. So I think if we have 2 Braga Fresh Field Days a year, if we work with our partners at Taylor and Driscoll, D'Arrigo and those to add a couple more of those on, if we get 60 to 100 people out there on a field day, that's a lot of people who understand more about regenerative. They understand more about resources. They've got Wild Farm Alliance and these guys as part of these efforts. So you've got some NGO involvement. I think getting the word out on what's working and what's not working so we can shortcut some of the bad paths in regenerative is huge and does de-risk the move to regen. But every grower has to know my field's not Rod's field and my field's not Bruce's field. I may have a different set of math. So they've got to commit to it over a long term. That's the one thing I hear is the first time you do any practice on regen, you learn a ton and you spend a ton. And right. And so make the capital commitment when you're coming over this way. So we think field days are a big part of it. And we just rolled out at the WG board meeting this week our first automation case study. We will be doing biological case studies as well. What the case study does is it's Western Growers branded. So it's us through the voice of our growers like Eric and Braga telling us about, in this case, carbon robotics, the laser weeder. How did the math work for us to buy a 1.49, I believe, $1 million piece of equipment for laser weeding? How did that work? Well, we walk you through all the economics of what human weeding costs across a couple thousand acres for JB Smith and Braga. We walk you through every cost of the equipment cost. Are you leasing or buying? We used a 5-year depreciation model off a buy. We used a lease in the second case. That's what the grower told us, right? So we work these models through, and what gets you past the dogma is the math, right? So we've got some of the most detailed spreadsheets out there. And so what we're doing now, part 2 and 3 of the rollout, or we have the case study that's out there. I'll be posting that on LinkedIn and other stuff online. It'll be on the WGA website next week. And then part 2 of that is we're rolling out an economic template. This is the spreadsheet that Ben Pallone, my new colleague at Western Growers, is using to basically say, here's the math template for you. Now let's go do the discovery part and figure out what goes in, because the math's easy. It's the discovery of the numbers that's hard, right? What are you paying for labor? Using direct, you go in H2A. Using an FLC, how much does that cost you? Is it a mix of labor, right? What kind of tractor? Is it a 5-year? Is it a 3-year? What's the depreciation schedule? All that math has to be worked through. Again, the spreadsheet's easy. Putting the numbers in the cells is a little hard, right? So we're doing a do-it-yourself option, and we're doing a WG Assist option where Western Growers will help you do that math. Think of it as an outsourced financial analyst for you to work with us. We're doing the first 5 free for our members, and over time, this will become a product that you can just raise your hand and say, I'd like to buy this part-time financial analyst for a couple of weeks to help me out. Because nobody wants to go hire a financial analyst full-time if you don't have to work for it, but you can go through us and get a part-time one. We'll roll the same process: case study, do-it-yourself template, and a WG Assist template in biologicals. It won't be this quarter or next. It might be Q4, but we're going to get that out there. And this is why, because we need to get past the dogma. And the best way is show people the math and give them tools to do their own math, and then they can get past it.
Amazing answer. Love that. Well, I have like 100 more questions for you, but we're getting a bunch of really good questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to jump there because that's fun. So we have one on sort of the balance between, I think, food safety and regenerative ag. And the exact wording of the question is, the sterility paradigm of big box buyers impedes the adoption of these bio-intensive soil management and, embracing biodiversity above and below the ground. So how does regenerative ag and organic overcome the food safety concerns around these bio-intensive sort of methods?
Meaning the food safety risk from live organisms?
I believe so. I believe that's what they're pointing to, right? Or like just having, more biodiversity on the farm, right? You're going to have all these pollinator rows. So I guess what? There's more potential for rodents or other kind of creatures around.
Oh, yeah, that's fair. So I would say, and that is a good question. And I would say, folks should realize, and I think a lot of the folks on this call probably know, but it's amazing how much food safety that you are having to do these days in terms of reporting and traps and rodents. I mean, one of our big growers I talked to, he's literally hiring a full-time equivalent person. And we're not talking like a, King City High School kid like me back in the 80s. We're talking someone with probably a degree, at least a 2-year, maybe a 4-year degree, and they've got a decent salary behind them. They need one person these days to run the food safety just for the traps, not the tests, right? Just for the rodent traps around the perimeters of fields. To
Whoa.
trap them, reload the traps, report that out, and get that to the county so they can do alerts on hotspots. That is one guy every 1,000 acres. That's a lot. Then you've got tests, right? You've got food, water, and product tests. And remember, you can't harvest more than sometimes 3, sometimes 5, sometimes 7 days after your last clean test. So you're running a bunch of food safety tests out there all the time. So that's not going to change. You'll still run those tests for food safety. You'll still have the animal traps for food safety. I mean, our big guys are running tens of thousands of tests during harvest season in Salinas Valley in the summer, no doubt about it, right? And it's Primus labs, other labs, and all kinds of stuff staying busy. So what I would say is, I think we've got food safety protocols that already account for a lot of the risk factors. This is just one more risk factor. Working against that, though, what I would say is, and this is a working theory. I've talked to a bunch of folks, Gina Kofer, Wilbur Ellis, and stuff. Does soil health allow you to sort of inoculate yourself against some of this stuff, right? So does the fact that we're not ripping and tilling all the time, does that actually create better soil health that we can metric against, that we can then test against and say, okay, it's like a FICO score, right? If my credit score is 800, my soil's healthier, I don't get as many positive hits. If it's 700, I get more positive hits, right? And so I think part of this is just continuing to refine the testing, continue to refine the practices around food safety, because we're not getting out of food safety, right? That's not going to happen. And so as we, and this is a great example of the unknowns. When you start putting in cover crops and not tilling as often, what kind of rodents do show up and how often, right? And if that changes, your operation's at more risk. And so you may need some more tools. Back to our portfolio analysis, chemistry and biology, both very useful. And we need to have both in our toolkit for a while. Remember, Shane Thomas, who's one of the brightest minds in the space, got a great newsletter, Upstream Ag, which I highly recommend to everybody. Freemium or paid. I get the paid, it's worth it for me. But the freemium's awesome. Shane will tell you that chemistry and biology products are both going to be, I believe the number is $120 billion industries in 2043. So even with all the regulatory pressure, biology and chemistry, according to Shane's forecast from current growth rates out 20 years, it's going to take 20 years for biology to catch chemistry in terms of dollar spent, right? So chemistry is not going anywhere soon unless DC, Sacramento, and the EU get even more aggressive. Entirely possible. Or our preferred result, the biologicals get more efficacious. This cover crop stuff and regenerative stuff works better than we hoped, or we scale it faster than we hoped, and we get that soil health. So basically, the innovations happen, or the regulators bring the hammer. We're hoping for the carrot, not the stick.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking about kind of the biologic space, you referenced this a few times, and I think this is kind of a little bit of an ongoing. There's a bit of a pattern, right? Seems like there's a new biologic company every 2 days. So that's the ongoing joke, right?
Yeah.
What is going on with the space? Why is it so busy? And you mentioned that you think of those 1,200 biologic companies, we'll probably see about 800 go out of business over the next few years. What is going to help growers find the winners, right? What's going to help them winnow the wheat from the chaff? How are they going to really find what's a valuable product out there versus what's just kind of snake oil bug in a jug?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. We think about it a lot, and we need to do it. So what I think is gonna help the space get there is again back to the math, right? You've got to understand, so let's back up first. So why I think the space is on fire. Now that CEA and alternative protein have cooled off, right, and have gotten their just rewards, Biologicals probably the #1 space in funding for a couple reasons, right? So you think about biologicals, what is the #1 thing an investor loves to see is regulatory pressure, right? Because that forces innovation to happen faster, right? And so an investor loves to see that. And so as much as we hate all the pressure on chemistry, if I'm an investor like our partners at S2G, the accelerators like Thrive, Plug and Play, the rest of them that are out there, they're looking at that and saying, okay, if more and more chemistry is under pressure, that's going to force these biologicals to get to market even faster. So that means R&D has to happen faster. That means go to market has to happen faster. That means they need capital, but I can justify the capital investment easier because I know regulatory is going to push it, or it's going to put its thumb on the market, not the marketplace, but thumb on the scale, if you will, and push it even faster. So I think why it's hot is because there's a couple of reasons. #1, that regulatory pressure is a big deal. #2, the folks that are the most likely strategic investors and M&A partners in this space, the Bayers, Syngentas, UPLs, the chemical inputs guys, and the distributors, the nutrients of the world, right? They are out there and they're looking for the next thing, right? They know chemistry's under pressure. They know Shane's numbers. They're all reading that stuff too, right? So they look at this and they say, I need to be looking at my internal R&D stuff to the earlier discussion. I need to be looking at R&D and seeing, can I get there from here? And I need to be rounding out the portfolio with some strategic and M&A work, right? So I think that's another thing investors look at and say, if you believe my thesis from earlier, that the investors are going to look at and say, okay, R&D is going to be tough for Bayer, Syngenta, UPL, already proving out. So they're probably writing checks for strategic and M&A at a higher level with more capital. That would be another buy sign, another invest sign for venture, right? And then finally, just on a global basis, it's not just the regulators, it's the buyers, it's the Walmarts, it's the Starbucks, it's the Whole Foods, it's the Krogers. They're all putting buyer specifications out there that are forcing certain things like no chemistry usage. The more that happens, so it's regulatory on two sides. It's the buyer regulations and it's the government regulations that are both pushing away from chemistry usage. And again, it's hard to walk away from that when your buyer who's writing you big checks for your product says, I need you to stop using X. You definitely want a replacement for X and you want a biological product that can replace X. So I think those three factors are what keeps the space hot. What's going to separate those 50 to 100 good outcomes from the 1,200 out of the, and that therefore the space, in my opinion, will be the #1 investment space in agri-food tech the next couple of years. So you're going to see more startups. What's going to separate the wheat from the chaff, if you will, is which of those startups are able to get to market with a clear value proposition that is grower focused, that justifies the check and delivers good economics. The same way that we know that laser weeder across a couple thousand acres with H2A labor and a 5-year depreciation works under these circumstances. We want to be able to know these biological products, this biological product works as an alternative to chemistry in these conditions, on these acreage, on these crop types, right? We're not there yet, but that's where we're going. So I think it's Western growers and all of the ecosystem's job to help validate those startups and help vet them. The other thing I think we're doing, Charlie, is you've got 3 stages of field trials. You've got the ones you guys are well past now with Braga, but you've got the first step, does it work, right? It just doesn't work. Secondly, does it work at scale with no unintended consequences, right? So I can work it once in a spinach field, great. Can I work it 10 times in the spinach field with no bad outcomes? Okay, great. Now it works at scale. And then you've got does it work in a grower operation at grower scale? Those 2 first field trials, this is one of the big learnings of the last year for me and the biologicals folks. You don't need those to happen on Braga, Taylor, Diorigo. You can have those on properly, that's key, properly grown, right? Commercial-like, but not commercial operations. So you can put that on co-op extension acreage at like the Hartnell-Alisal campus or the other. I mean, they've got thousands of acres all over California where we can test this stuff out. You don't need production operations to do that. In fact, what we're arguing with Western growers is for the does it work test, go see UCA&R, go get tested on their land with co-op extension. That's what they've got. We've got 5 of them here in Salinas to help out. We got 1 dedicated to field trials now. Thank you, Glenn de Humiston and the UCA&R folks. So come to Salinas, come see us. We'll get you into trials, but you don't get a grower trial first. You got to prove it works, then prove it works a couple times. We'll help with the test strategy and stuff like that. But once you get those first 2 trials done, then we bring you to the grower. Then we bring you to the moment of truth. Does it work the way they want it to in their operation? Doesn't matter what the co-op extension guy said at that point. It matters what the grower thinks because they're the check writer. So that three-step process, getting those first two stages off of growers, and I was just as guilty at Thrive. I told everyone, go see a grower, go see a grower. Don't go see a grower. Come see Western growers. We'll get you to the grower after you pass the first two hurdles.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, we've got a bunch of other good questions. We've got one from our friend Gina Colfer at Wilbur Ellis. She
Hey,
said,
Gina.
it's a little bit of a longer question, but it's a good one. So I'm going to just read it out.
He's good that way.
If the regenerative term doesn't have one voice, it might not catch hold. And organic is strengthened with SOE. So now they need to market it to support these organic growers and demand more money from the consumer. But the standard of farming should be sustainable and building soil health and sequestering carbon through increasing carbon, increasing microbial diversity and activity, and having the soil, roots, residues, carbon inputs, nutrients, all of that help build the soil and then build the plant. Our money's going towards irrigation management and improved application equipment, mowers, reverse mulchers, and fund the growers to implement, because once again, the technology is very expensive, but it actually is cheaper in the long run. And to have this justified and so on, trialing needs to happen. And she says, so as Eric says, fail forward. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I look forward to catching up with Gina live at our next event. And it's exactly right. So I think, and what Gina's alluding to is we've in the past provided a lot of incentives with government revenue to purchase equipment, right? And I'll give you an example right now. And here's what I would fundamentally shift, right? So CARB, the Cal Air Resources Board, paid out $150 million in equipment subsidies to electric equipment manufacturers, Monarch, et cetera, right? The EV tractors, to basically pay a guy to retire an old diesel tractor. Now, this program has been abused, right? You've seen people buying old tractors on eBay, digging out the old rattiest tractor from the equipment graveyard and just turning it in for a trade-in credit. And that 115 million, let's be real here, right?
Yeah.
And so when you put money out there and you put a lot of it out there, folks are going to go get it, right? And so I would say, why are we spending 115 million to reduce a pretty nominal amount of greenhouse gas emissions from diesel tractors? When, to your point, Gina, we could spend that 115 million on equipment credits for stuff that does more of this. So it's not that government money shouldn't get spent. It's that the priorities are a little misplaced. I think rather than, and just so you know the math, I did the math for everyone. It would be $5 to $10 billion in California taxpayer money to try to whole diesel fleet and flip it over to electric. And then we'd have a charging nightmare on our hands with no infrastructure to support it, right? So I would say, rather than chase the electric Xanadu dream that the folks in Sacramento seem to have stuck in their head on repeat, why don't we use that money more intelligently this direction? Because we know the outcomes are going to be better, and we know that soil health is going to get better, and we know this equipment is a key part of making it happen. Right. So I think the incentive structure is equipment based a lot of times and could be in the form of either a tax credit off the purchase or a trade-in or a direct reimbursement for the equipment. There's a lot of ways you can execute that. But Gina's right. Helping equipment get out there more often and helping equipment get out there faster and to more growers will get this stuff to, we'll fail forward when we can do this faster and at scale. Government has a role to play in that, probably as a check writer. And again, I don't think we need new dollars. Just start writing the carb checks that way, bring them this way.
Got it. There's another great question kind of that dovetails right into that, and it's from our CEO at Agrology, so I probably shouldn't ask it.
It's a test, Charlie. Be careful.
Yeah. A key challenge to early AgTech companies, our early AgTech companies face is getting grants or other public funding to offset the costs and risks of new products. The USDA and state agencies have funding, but it's really hard to get at. Do you have any suggestions here?
Around funding for?
I think an AgTech startups, right? Like, SBIR grants or
the actual startups, right?
Yeah,
right.
The startups.
So yes, so I am a big fan of what you just mentioned, the SBIR grants. I know multiple startups that have gotten multiple tranches, and what people don't realize is the number one win for SBIR funding is it is non-equity, right? Yeah. So that money comes in. it is non-equity. And so what that allows you to do is, and I've had startups do multiple tranches. So you can get a 250K tranche, a 500 tranche, and $1 million tranche. And that actually comes with SCORE, the retired executive folks that work with that program. So you can get both executive advisors to help out. And again, we've got a mentor database at Western Growers, happy to get folks in touch with. I've got 54 guys now that'll happily help you with the mentoring side of it. But basically, two things you should do. Number one, get a financial analyst involved early before you start making big hiring decisions so that you need less capital. Number two, take advantage of the new tools. Like what I'm hearing from this is back to the All In podcast and back to the BG2 podcast. You are getting super engineers now that can use AI bots to both write code and quality check code in real time. So you can turn what was a couple of 250K engineers into like 250K engineers and some bots. You can turn a lot of 1 to 2 year projects development side into now 3 to 6 month projects. So I think if you're on the analytics side, not on the hardware side, to be fair, you can start a startup and get it to MVP, minimum viable product, for less than you ever had. And that's only going down. You may not even need venture capital. If you're in the equipment world, however, the SBIR can help you with 1, 2, or 3 tranches. There are milestones you need to hit and check-ins you need to complete, and it takes about 6 to 9 months to get it. So if you're applying now, don't plan on it this year. It's probably early next year to get it. But if you can apply for those, I won't say they're unused dollars, but they're available dollars at a pretty high rate. I mean, I've seen folks when they showed me their first pitch for the SBIR, it was a little light, but it made the point and it got it across. So number one, check your math. Know who you need to hire. Number two, take advantage of the new dev tools that are out there. They are fantastic on the AI front alone. And number three, SBIR is a great non-equity source of funding. The things I'm not as wild about but are out there, crowdfunding doesn't tend to work in AgTech. There's been a couple examples. Grow Guru got out there. Patrick, a great CEO, was able to put one together. You see about 2 or 3 every so often. AgTech crowd funds, but for my money, SBIR is the way to go. And that if you can get grant funding around research before you get to full product, I think that's a big help. And again, you can apply for the California has the small block, the specialty block. Sorry, federal has the specialty crop block grants. California has its own set of grants around that tool. Again, largely R&D, early stage stuff. And then folks like Inez Hanrahan, the Washington Tree Fruit Research Association, if you're doing tree fruit stuff, she will fund startups as well. Again, non-equity from a pool of growers. So know the vertical you're going after, know the crop you're going after, know the trade groups that are there, know what the state funding sources are, know what the federal funding sources are, plan on some lead time, but you can get some capital that's not venture capital, because as I've said often, I'm not sure venture capital is a great fit for a lot of ag tech, but it's what we have. Even in a down year, we're still 15.6 billion. That will fund a lot of startups. It'll just fund a lot less than 50.
Yeah, absolutely. Agrology got a few tranches of the SBIR grants, and it was huge for us. Like you said, non-equity, non-dilutive, and they seem to really like, stuff that's a little bit risky and it's like disruptive.
Yes.
They enjoy that stuff. So,
and I will take it one step further. You're right in their sweet spot, right? So a guy doing SBIR for a new chemical efficiency tool, I predict would not do as well as you, right? They like what they like. They like climate smart. They like environmental. They don't like chemistry. So know who you're pitching. If you're going for SBIR right now and foreseeable future, bring a climate smart message with you. Bring a climate friendly message with you. Bring some talking points around that, and make sure the math is solid, because you will have to check in. Did you? How long was that process for you on SBIR, Charlie? How far and how much money?
So that's all details that I don't actually have. But
okay.
I know we've gotten 2 or maybe even 3 tranches. I think we just finished up our second one.
And probably a couple years worth of capital.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really, I think, was the primary funding for the first 2 years of the company. We're about 4 years old, and I think the first 2 years was primarily SBIR. So speaking of kind of the climate friendly focus stuff, I think that there's a question that this is leading to from the Q&A. I think sometimes there is, people always talk about the carbon tunnel vision, right? And I think that there is sort of a double-edged sword there, right? In a lot of ways, it's the gasoline on the fire of regenerative agriculture. Everyone is so focused on regenerative agriculture, no-till, all around carbon sequestration. But I always really like to not only say, but shout from the mountaintops that healthy soil does a hell of a lot more than just sequester carbon. And there's actually probably some things that are maybe even more important than sequestering carbon, especially when we talk about nutrient mineralization and nutrient availability, better water holding capacity in like places like the Central Valley, where water is going to be their limiting factor. Um, how do you like, can you talk a little bit about how the focus on climate might actually be taking attention away from or even hurting these other factors like biodiversity, food security, and most importantly, farmer profitability, right? Just financial sustainability. I think that's actually the greatest offering that regenerative agriculture has. John Kempf, founder of AEA, always talks about it takes a few years, takes, 3 to 5 years, but he's seen every single operation that has transitioned to regenerative ag is now more profitable. There's just a, maybe even their yields are slightly lower, but they're still more profitable overall as an operation. So how do you think that this super, hyper focus on carbon and climate is either helping or hurting or probably doing both to regenerative agriculture?
Yeah, no, and I'll go back to the other example, right? That carb example, again, that 115 million, that's a lot of money, right? A lot of California taxpayer money. We're now in a $73 billion deficit hole in California on a $300 billion nut. That's a lot, right? That's a problem. And it's a big change in a year. So when you have limited resources, you can only spend them so many places. So when our focus is solely on the emissions, we miss a lot of the other benefits, right? And when that's all we're measuring is emissions, and that's all we're funding, in the case of those carbon emissions off diesel tractors, we miss a lot of funding opportunities to do the stuff you just mentioned, right? And John Kempf and the others are right. You do a lot more than just carbon with regenerative stuff, right? And so part of it's on the industry to help measure that other stuff you mentioned, right? I mean, can we come up with like a FICO score for soil health? Can we come up with some kind of a metric that measures that and not just the carbon that's sequestered? That would help, right?
Yep.
Can we come up with a way to not just measure it, but then measure it over time? And then can you set certain, again, to your point, is it outcome based or practice based, right? You could actually move to outcome based potentially at that point, which would be interesting with a different set of funding. So I would like to see funding switch from just retiring diesel tractors in favor of electrics for a lot of challenging reasons to things like this. And that'll be a decision that California, the folks up in Sacramento get to make with input from all of us. Folks in DC get to make with input from all of us, and we'll see. But I think you're right. If all you folks, if emissions are your only, hammer, everything looks like a nail, and anything you can't nail, it's just crazy. And so I think the focus on emissions does hurt the movement. It does slow down the movement because it allocates capital inefficiently. And in fact, I would argue we're probably way over our skis in terms of capital market allocation on carbon marketplaces at the moment relative to other stuff in regenerative. And again, I want marketplaces to happen. I want carbon to get there out of the right metric. I want there to be less grower risk versions of it. But right now it's sucking up all the capital because that's where folks see the opportunity is. We need to articulate the opportunity better to investors and to founders that, hey, there's stuff you can do other than carbon marketplaces that's just as entertaining, just as big. And then we have to make sure we're right. Because I'm not sure if some of it, I think carbon marketplaces has the opportunity to be huge globally. We need other opportunities to be huge locally and regionally, but we need them to get funding too. And right now the funding is going, I would say, to some places that are not as good as others in that sense,
Yeah,
from a
it's not
holistic standpoint, if that makes, sorry, long answer. But
no, that was a great answer. That was perfect. So we are at the top of the hour, so I just want to kind of acknowledge that. I would love to ask you a few more questions and
I'm
just
good.
yeah, keep it cruising. But if anyone has to jump, thanks so much for joining us. Again, we'll be sending out the recording so you can catch the last few questions.
You're keeping me for a Sherwood Hall Chamber of Commerce luncheon, but that can wait.
Perfect. All right, let's go till noon. So kind of a follow-up question on that. I've been diving into the carbon markets quite a bit. Obviously, Agrology is, I think one thing we're really proud of is we're well positioned to help growers access those markets. But on top of that, we're also looking at these other ecological benefits, microbial activity, water infiltration, water retention. We've been finding like in regenerative vineyards, for example, we can actually monitor and show they have cooler temperatures in the canopy. So they're getting higher quality grapes, less desiccation, a lot of different things. But circling back on the carbon stuff specifically, we've seen that there's exorbitant prices being paid for carbon credits that are not inside of agriculture. So for example, these carbon basically carbon suckers that are then piping the carbon down into abandoned mines, that kind of things, up to
Right.
$1,000 for a metric ton or more sometimes. How do you think that and what's holding back agricultural carbon credits? Like, why are they so low? Is it a problem of just not accurate measurement, or are folks just not trusting them because of the issues around permanence and whether you could just go and till and then release that carbon? Or kind of like what's holding agricultural carbon credits back? And how can we build a bridge to a place where maybe we're not seeing $1,000 per credit, but maybe $500 or $600? And then that, that's the kind of thing where a Salinas Valley grower is actually going to be really interested in. It's going to really move the needle.
Yeah, well, I think your answer is right, Sean. You've answered the question a little bit yourself. Part of it is the Midwest crops have a much higher financial interest in the $15 per ton because you can do it. If you're doing 10,000 acres of corn and soy, different game, right? And that's a thin margin business on, $2 or $4 corn sometimes. So in the Midwest, I think you'll see larger adoption earlier, especially crops with the dollars we're making per acre. It's just a much less interesting set of math. So you're right. Until it goes from that 15 to 20 range up to hundreds of dollars per acre, and until there's more risk management possible for storing it. Because again, and you've heard this from Eric, right? I mean, some guys can't go to no-till because you got rotational crops, but going to low-till should get you a lot of the way there, right? So I think you're going to see a lot of stuff coming up the next couple of years around this space, but it's going to be you're just gonna have to be patient with this because again, we've talked about it. These practice changes all take a long time, and these practice changes all require you to work in different conditions, and we're the incremental value of that carbon credit is not worth the time and labor that it's taking at them. I'll say it that way. Like the value of that $15 is just not worth the juice. The juice isn't worth the squeeze, right? It's just not. And I can't give you that many specialty crop growers who have said, yeah, the math's totally worth it. They'll do it to help check a box for a buyer, right? Yeah. But that doesn't mean it's the right answer. So I think watch the Midwest. They'll get there first. Western Europe's gone the other way with massive government subsidies on that stuff. I wouldn't recommend that, no surprise. But basically, don't follow the Western Europe model. Let the marketplace find its own traction or not. I think it will find some traction in Midwest crops because corn and soy guys are still in a struggle position. And this is a universal problem of ag. Everyone overproduces too much. So everyone has some financial incentive to look for extra revenue streams. The Midwest may be in the most dire boat from that position, right? And that's even with an 8 million drop in corn and soy acres, according to the last USDA census report. So we're down acres, but they've gone other places, and globally, folks have replaced them in other acreage. So there's a global market to worry about as well. So I think don't juice the market with extra government subsidies. Let that happen as it happens. But for specialty crop to get interesting, two things have to happen: the dollar price per ton has to go up, and the risk of that coming back in an audit later has to go down.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look to places like Australia, where I would argue that they have kind of more of a mature carbon market than we do, they had some government regulation, and so they kind of standardized the marketplace. We are seeing higher prices than that. Massively, we're not in the hundreds of dollars, but we're definitely well above. We're in the $30 to $50 range.
Right.
Again, depending on the project, depending on the quality of measurement. That's another pattern we see.
And just that move, Charlie, would help juice the market, right? I mean, you double it. A lot of corn and soy guys would say, okay, I'll raise my hand. Then you get some traction in the marketplace with buyer and seller activity. Suddenly it goes to 50 to 60, and it gets there, pun intended, organically, right? Instead of getting thumb on the scale. So I think that, and that can totally happen. That's how it started. My understanding is from Europe, and then Europe decided to just jump on the scale with both hands. And we'll see how that works out for them.
Yeah, absolutely. So last sort of question, or maybe we'll see if that's true. That might be a lie, but last question for now. Regenerative agriculture obviously has a lot of kind of social momentum behind it, right? We could all pretty much agree there's a lot of wind in those sails. Like we talked about, the economics of it, I think there's some more work to be done there, right? The supply chains are still being built, kind of live. How do you see regenerative agriculture influencing, either helping or hurting, kind of the ag tech space? And what do you see as sort of the nexus between those two? Seems like there's more and more companies like Agrology, Trace Genomics and Biomakers and Quantera and all these companies that are focused on measuring soil health. And then we all have kind of our own unique spin on it, our unique kind of angle of measurement. But yeah, how do you see the nexus of regenerative agriculture and ag tech? Take us from this year to 5 years out.
No, it's a great question. That's a good time frame to look at. I would say a couple things. I think regenerative can help accelerate traceability, because if you want to show them where it came from and you want to show them the nice regeneratively grown farm, nothing better than a little QR code on the SKU in the store that tracks it back to the Soledad field that Braga's farming to say, hey, here's what it looked like over the course of the grow. Here's the operation to put it together. So I think supply chain traceability benefits from regen and from customers wanting it if that happens. And then I think in terms of back to the earlier discussion, the more events we can do and case studies we can do to spread the word, the more we can get regen adopted at lower risk, right? So the more Braga fresh field days and stuff like that. So the industry has a role to play as well. So I think in 5 years, you'll see more regen because we've taken the veil off and showed some numbers and showed some details and showed some data in coordination with nonprofits and UC and the educators and researchers. So I think in a perfect world, that gets more regenerative adoption. That then funds the virtuous circle of the researchers having more capital to spend on their stuff. And this is where UC Davis, Cal Poly, the rest of the ag schools can do a good job working with the growers, test the next set of regen practices for us, right? I mentioned it earlier, the first set of field trials, they should not be on grower operations. So the more trials Davis, Cal Poly, Fresno State, UC Merced can run, the better to get that stuff proven out and into the marketplace at scale, right? It's gonna take those proof points on the way to getting real. So I think better implementation by the UC gets this to happen faster. I think Braga Fresh Field Days at scale gets this to happen faster. I think on the support side, it helps things like traceability, supply chain, and marketability at retail, right? Because you've got one more buzzword if used correctly that can happen. Where I don't think it does a lot is in terms of the actual farmer's operation, you know, you're still going to need labor to make all this stuff happen. And maybe like organic, you're going to need more labor in some cases, right? And if you use less chemistry, you're definitely going to need more labor. You're still going to need a lot of water, but less water. I would agree with that. So you could see more water efficiency. I tend to think we've squeezed, no pun intended, a lot of the blood out of that stone with drip, alternative pipes, the yellow pipe, the blue pipe. We made it easier to move around, easier to get to just the right, drops per crop type of metric. So I think we will, and that's another point worth making. And I talked about this with Sean Darnaghy from Driscoll's at an event a while back. The drops per crop metric is great because it forces you to get water efficient or get water smart, right? And either one will work. So I think if we start tracking that stuff a little bit better, and regen can help with that, and regen can help improve those metrics, that's all good. So I think you'll definitely see more awareness at the board level of both the buyers of our products and the growers themselves that are vertically integrated to pay more attention to this. So part of this is just having that chief sustainability officer, if you will, inside organizations raises the awareness. That then leads to the practice adoption at wider scale and some capital. And that then leads to the supply chain traceability stuff. Sorry, another long answer, but hopefully that makes sense. So I think the awareness drives the funding and the strategy to get all this implemented faster and at more scale.
Awesome. That was super helpful, super insightful. Okay, last question for real now. This one's a good one, and it's from the Q&A, and I just want to make sure I hit it. It's about kind of mindset and sort of, there definitely is, I don't know, a trope that a lot of growers are very traditional, right? And they're a little bit resistant to change. So there is, and I think that can be true, and that can be the farthest thing from the truth ever. But the question is from Aaron, and they say, I've observed that you can't convince anyone to do anything. I've observed that when farmers have had a mindset shift, they are open to education, trials, looking at demonstration sites, going to the field days, looking at the map, all this. And when farmers haven't had this mindset shift, I have not seen any supports work to move them to these different practices, whether it's education, field days, case studies, any of that. They just aren't open to digesting this new information because it might shift their paradigm. Have you observed the same thing? And what do you think we can do to get people, I guess, like over the fence post in this case, to really, be curious and going out and checking out the Taylors and the Bragas and going to these field days?
So I totally agree with that, Aaron. It's a great point. And it's a bell curve of growers, right? There are early adopter growers, early majority growers, late majority growers, classic crossing the chasm, right? And so guys like Braga and Taylor, they're out there on the cutting edge trying stuff. It doesn't always work. They've got the arrows in their backs to prove it. And we appreciate them doing that. Your next generation of growers, your next bell curve portion, if you will, they're going to want to hear from the growers, not from the startups. This is key, right? This is why Braga Fresh Field Days works. You get growers coming to hear from other growers, and we don't put too many startups on stage. We put more growers on stage. That's by design, right? My panel at the end of the day, the last Braga Fresh, had what? Taylor, Driscoll, I can't, but basically 3 growers, no startups, right? That's who the growers want to hear from. They want to hear from the guys using the cool tools, and sharing the math is going to get them comfortable. But I will say this on the startup side, for all you founders out there, you need to identify where that prospect is on that bell curve pretty early. If they're on the back end of the tail, late adapter, fire that prospect and say, we'll call you back later. You won't get them converted over, right? If they're on the front side of that and they're in that early majority, and how do you sleuth that out? Look at their equipment, look at what they're using, look at how many cobwebs it has on it, and look at what they've got that's newer and when they bought stuff, and get a feel for their operation. If they've got a bunch of early stuff and they're using it and they're not quite there, but it's getting close, they're more on the early adopter side, right? If they've got a bunch of older equipment and it's sitting around gathering dust and they're throwing labor at every problem, probably not your early adopter, right? So do some homework, get out to the farm, see their operation. You'll get a feel for where they are on the curve. If they're not on the stage of the bell curve you're at, get out of there, right? They're not ready for you. You're not ready for them.
That's great advice. Well, Walt, it is always such a pleasure chatting with you. I feel like I learn about 30 new things every single time. So thanks so
Great
much
to chat,
for spending the
Charlie.
morning with us. And again, we'll send out the recording to everyone, and great questions and engagement. So yeah, thanks everyone for being here. We'll send out my information in case you want to learn anything about Agrology. And I'm sure you can get in contact with Walt if you want to as well. So yeah, thanks again for your time and all of your experience and expertise, and also for doing so much for the ag tech space, you know, as a startup ourselves. Western growers and you, and yeah, you know, just everyone in the Salinas Valley has been an extremely supportive community. So we really appreciate all of your support and all of your insights.
Appreciate that, Charlie. It takes a village. We're glad you're in it, and we're happy to be there.
Awesome. All right. Have a good rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.
You too. Cheers, everyone. Thank you.